The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel or simply the wheel, was a torture device used for capital punishment from antiquity into early modern times for public execution by breaking the criminal's bones, bludgeoning him to death. As a form of execution, it was used from classical times into the 18th century, as a form of post-mortem punishment of the criminal. The wheel was still in use in 19th century Germany. Description: the wheel was typically a large wooden wagon wheel with many radial spokes. The condemned were lashed to the wheel and the limbs were beaten with a club or iron cudgel, with the gaps in the wheel allowing the limbs to give way and break. Alternatively, the condemned were spread-eagled and broken on a saltire, a cross consisting of two wooden beams nailed in an X shape, after which the victim's mangled body might be displayed on the wheel. A wheel was sometimes used for the actual bludgeoning. During the execution for parricide of Franz Subolt in Nuremberg on the 22nd of September 1589, a wheel was used as a cudgel. The executioner used wooden blocks to raise Subolt's limbs, then broke them by slamming a wagon wheel down onto the limb. The survival time after being broken could be extensive. Accounts exist of a 14th-century murderer who lived for 3 days after undergoing the punishment. In 1348, during the time of the Black Death, a Jew named Bonadies underwent the punishment. The authorities stated he lived for 4 days and nights afterwards. In 1581, German serial killer Christmann Genipetinger lived for 9 days on the breaking wheel before expiring, having been deliberately kept alive with strong drink. Legal UHU Peter Spirenberg mentions a reference in 6th century author Gregory of Tours as a possible origin for the punishment of breaking someone on the wheel. In Gregory's time, a criminal could be placed in a deep track, and then a heavily laden wagon was driven over him. Thus, the latter practice could be seen as a symbolic reenactment of the previous penalty in which people were literally driven over by a wagon. In France, the condemned were placed on a cartwheel with the limbs stretched out along the spokes over 2 sturdy wooden beams. The wheel was made to revolve slowly, and a large hammer or an iron bar was then applied to the limb over the gap between the beams, breaking the bones. This process was repeated several times per limb. Sometimes it was mercifully or ordered that the executioner should strike the condemned on the chest and abdomen, blows known as coups de grace, which caused fatal injuries. Without those, the broken man could last hours and even days, during which birds could peck at the helpless victim. Eventually, shock and dehydration caused death. In France, a special grace, the retentum, could be granted, by which the condemned was strangled after the second or third blow, or in special cases, even before the breaking began. Holy Roman Empire. In the Holy Roman Empire, the wheel was punishment reserved primarily for men convicted of aggravated murder. Less severe offenders would be cudgeled top down, with a lethal first blow to the neck. More heinous criminals were punished bottom up, starting with the legs, and sometimes being beaten 4 hours. The number and sequence of blows was specified in the court's sentence. Corpses were left for carrion eaters, and the criminals' heads often placed on a spike. The Zürcher Blutgerichtsordnung dates from the 15th century and contains a detailed description of how the breaking on the wheel shall occur. Firstly, the delinquent is placed belly down, bound hands and feet outstretched to a board, and thus dragged by a horse to the place of execution. The wheel is then slammed 2 times on each arm, one blow above the elbow, the other below. Then, each leg gets the same treatment above and below the knees. The final 9th blow is given at the middle of the spine, so that it breaks. Then, the broken body is woven onto the wheel, and the wheel is then hammered onto a pole, which is then fastened upright in its other end in the ground. The criminal is then to be left dying afloat on the wheel, and be left to rot. A curious and instructional case of an executioner's willful malpractice. On the 1st of October 1786 in the county of Tecklenburg, Heinrich Doll was to be executed by being broken on the wheel, on account of the aggravated murder of a Jew. The court had decided that Doll should be broken v'nibben herab. The first stroke of the wheel should crush his chest. The court instructed the executioner Esmaev that Doll should be clandestinely strangled prior to the first stroke. The bystanders were shocked by what they thought was a severely botched execution by Esmaev and his son, and thought Doll had been alive during the entire proceeding, and also after Esmaev had secured Doll onto the wheel and raised it on a pole. The town physician climbed up on a ladder and could ascertain that Doll was indeed alive. Doll lingered on until he expired 6 hours later. The Esmaeus were brought to court for severe malpractice. It was established that the string around Doll's neck had not been drawn tightly enough, and that Esmaeus had, contrary to his duties as an executioner, accepted the use of a wheel that was not heavy enough. That lacking weight meant that the chest had not been crushed. Furthermore, one arm and one leg of Doll's had not broken according to proper penal procedure. And finally, the nail that was customarily hammered through the convict's brain in order to fasten him upon the wheel had been hammered in far too low. Many believed that Esmaeus' act of malpractice had been not so much a display of gross incompetence as it had been a deliberate act of cruelty, because Doll, just prior to his execution, had converted from Catholicism to that of the Reformed Church. The court did not find sufficient evidence for deliberate malice on Esmaeus' part, but sentenced him to 2 years hard labor and banning him from working ever again as an executioner. His young son was, on grounds of mercy, acquitted of any culpable wrongdoings. Indian subcontinent. In the history of Sikhs, there was a long struggle between the Sikh community and the Islamic rulers, resulting in a number of Sikhs laying down their life. In 1746 A.D., Bhai Subhag Singh and Bhai Shahbaz Singh were martyred by mounting on rotating wheels. These and numerous other martyrs are remembered in the daily prayer of Sikhs. Scotland. In Scotland, a servant named Robert Ware was broken on the wheel at Edinburgh in 1603 or 1604. This punishment had been used infrequently there. The crime had been the murder of John Kincaid, Lord of Warriston, on behalf of his wife. Ware was secured to a cartwheel and was struck and broken with the coulter of a plough. Lady Warriston was later beheaded. British and French colonial empire. This method of execution was used in 18th-century North America following slave revolts. It was once used in New York after several whites were killed during a slave rebellion in 1712. Between 1730 and 1754, 11 slaves in French-controlled Louisiana, who had revolted against the masters, were killed on the wheel. Romania. At the end of the revolt of Horia, Kloska and Crison, in 1785, 2 of the revolt leaders, Horia and Kloska, were sentenced to be executed by the breaking wheel. Crison hanged himself in prison before that sentence could be carried out. According to a book published the same year by Adam F. Geisler, the 2 leaders were broken von and ten off, that is, the limbs were broken whilst alive. Russia. The breaking wheel was frequently used in the Great Northern War in the early 1700s when the Tsardom of Russia challenged the supremacy of the Swedish Empire in northern Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Sweden. Johann Patkel was a Livonian gentleman who was condemned on charges of treason by Swedish King Charles XII in 1707. The priest Lawrence Hagen was a friend of Patkel's and described the horrors his friend had to endure when Patkel was condemned to be broken on the wheel. Here the executioner gave him the first stroke. His cries were terrible. "O Jesus, Jesus, have mercy upon me." Quote, This cruel scene was much lengthened out, and of the utmost horror, for as the headsman he had no skill in his business, the wretch under his hands received upwards of 15 blows, with each of which were intermixed the most piteous groans, and invocations at the name of God. At length, after 2 strokes given on the breast, his strength and voice failed him. In a faltering, dying tone, he was just heard to say, "Cut off my head," and the executioner still lingering, he himself placed his head on the scaffold. In a word, after 4 strokes with an hatchet, the head was separated from the body, and the body quartered. Such was the end of the renowned Patcal, and may God have mercy on his soul. Later use. The breaking wheel was used as a form of execution in Germany as recently as the early 19th century. Its use as a method of execution was not fully abolished in Bavaria until 1813, and still in use until 1836 in Hesse-Kassel. In Prussia, the punishment of death was inflicted by decapitation with a large sword, by burning, and by breaking on the wheel. At the time, the Prussian Penal Code required a criminal to be broken upon the wheel when a particularly heinous crime had been committed. The king always issued an order to the executioner to strangle the criminal before his limbs were broken. The last execution by this stronger form of capital punishment was on the 13th of August 1841. Metaphorical uses. The breaking wheel was also known as a great dishonor, and appeared in several expressions as such. In Dutch, there is the expression opgroeien voor galgenrad, to grow up for the gallows, and wheel, meaning to be destined to come to no good. It is also mentioned in the Chilean expression morir en la rueda, to die at the wheel, meaning to keep silent about something. The Dutch expression ik ben geradbraakt, literally I have been broken on the wheel, is used to describe physical exhaustion and pain. Like the German expression sick gerad voelen, to feel wheel, and the Danish expression radbreaket, refer almost exclusively to physical exhaustion and great discomfort. In Finnish telata, to execute by the wheel, refers to forceful and violent critique, a rejection of performance, ideas or innovations. The German verb radbrechen can refer to speaking incorrectly, for example with a strong foreign accent or with a great deal of foreign vocabulary. Similarly, the Norwegian radbreker can be applied to art and language, and refers to use which is seen as despoiling tradition and courtesy, with connotations of willful ignorance or malice. In Swedish, radbreker can be used in the same sense as the English idiom rack one's brain, or, as in German, to mangle language. The word roué, meaning a debauched, lecherous person, is French, and its original meaning was broken on the wheel. As execution by breaking on the wheel in France and some other countries was reserved for crimes of particular atrocity, roué came by a natural process to be understood to mean a man morally worse than a gallows bird, a criminal who only deserved hanging for common crimes. He was also a leader in wickedness, since the chief of a gang of brigands would be broken on the wheel, while his obscure followers were merely hanged. Philip, Duke of Orleans, who was regent of France from 1715 to 1723, gave the term the sense of impious and callous debauchery, which it has borne since his time, by habitually applying it to the very bad male company who amused his privacy and his leisure. The locus classicus for the origin of this use of the epithet is in the Memoirs of St. Simon. In English, the quotation, "who breaks a butterfly upon a wheel," from Alexander Pope's Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, is occasionally seen, referring to putting great effort into achieving something minor or unimportant. Execution of Saint Catherine. Medieval hagiographies, such as the Legenda Sanctorum, record that St. Catherine of Alexandria was executed on one of these devices for refusing to renounce her Christian belief, which thereafter became known as the Catherine wheel, also used as her iconographic attribute. The wheel miraculously broke when she touched it. She was then beheaded. As an attribute, it is usually shown broken in a small version beside her, or sometimes as a miniature she holds in her hand. The sword then used is also often shown. Coats of arms with Catherine wheels. Persons: Thomas de Brantingham, Catherine Swynford. Organizations: St. Catherine's College, Oxford. Places: Altena, Germany. Goa, India, when it was in Portuguese possession. Hjørring, Denmark, where St. Catherine is the patron saint of the town. Kaarina, Finland, until 2009, and Piekio's union with Kaarina. Kremnica, Slovakia. Kuldiga, Latvia. Molsheim, France. Niederbach, Germany. Prienem Chiemsee, Germany, where St. Catherine is the patron saint of the town. Sinai, Belgium. Gallery.